Okay, so Plato. We all sort of know the name, right? We throw around phrases like platonic love, maybe mention the academy.
Yeah, absolutely. But, how much do we really know about the guy himself, his background, what actually shaped him before he wrote all those famous dialogue?
Exactly. That's what we want to dig into for you today. We've looked at the historical accounts, and there's actually a lot there, family history, key influences.
It's a surprisingly complex picture. We're aiming to give you a much richer sense of this figure who, fundamentally shaped Western thought. Expect some surprises along the way.
Okay, let's jump in. Where do we start? His early life.
Let's kick things off there. And right away, what's interesting is that even the basic stuff isn't totally clear-cut.
Yeah.
His exact birth date, where he was born. Well, best guesses are Athens or maybe Aegina, and sometime between 429 and 423 BCE. But there's a bit of, historical fog around it.
So right from the start, a little mystery. But we do know he came from a pretty high-status family, don't we? An influential one.
Oh, definitely. Very prominent. His father, Ariston, supposedly traced his lineage back to Codrus, an early Athenian king, and even Melanthus, a king of Messenia.
Wow.
And there's even a tradition, though it's debated, mind you, linking the family all the way back to the god Poseidon.
Poseidon. Okay, that's quite a claim to fame. And his mother, Perictione.
She also had some serious connections. Her family was related to Solon.
The Solon, the famous lawmaker.
The very one of the 7 sages of Greece, the guy who reformed Draco's really harsh laws. So, yeah, significant lineage on both sides.
That's some heavy-hitting ancestry kings, legendary lawmakers, maybe even a god. But weren't there also some more politically charged figures in his immediate family?
That's a really important point. Perictione's brother was Charmides, and her uncle was Critias.
Ah, names that pop up later.
Exactly. And both became leading figures in the regime of the 30 Tyrants, that short, brutal dictatorship after Athens lost the Peloponnesian War.
Right, so he would have seen that political upheaval up close. Within his own family, you have to think that influenced his later political philosophy, right? His ideas about justice and the ideal state.
It almost certainly must have. Imagine witnessing that kind of power struggle and brutality firsthand. It really grounds his philosophical explorations in, well, some pretty harsh realities.
Makes sense. Now, there's also a rather strange story involving his parents. Something about a divine vision. Apollo.
Yes, that's another curious element. The story goes that Ariston initially approached Perictione, let's say without her full agreement, but then Apollo supposedly appeared to him in a vision.
Apollo himself.
So the story goes. And after this vision, Ariston respected Perictione's wishes. It adds a layer of myth or perhaps divine sanction to Plato's conception, a very dramatic family tale.
No kidding. Apollo stepping in. Quite the origin story. Now, Plato wasn't an only child, was he? He had siblings.
He did. 2 full brothers, Erymanthus and Glaucon, who you'll definitely recognize if you've read The Republic.
Right. They feature prominently there.
And a sister, Potone. She's important because her son, Speusippus, eventually took over from Plato as head of the academy.
Ah, keeping it in the family.
Sort of. Interestingly, there's a slight discrepancy about Glaucon's age. Xenophon implies he was younger than Plato, but in The Republic, Plato portrays him as older.
Maybe just a literary choice. Or reflecting complex family dynamics.
Could be either, really. It's one of those small details scholars debate, and then there's his mother's side again. After Ariston died, Perictione remarried.
Okay, who does she marry?
A man named Pyrilampes. He was actually a friend of Pericles, the famous Athenian statesman, and served as an ambassador to Persia.
Another well-connected figure.
Absolutely. And Pyrilampes already had a son, Demas, apparently known for his good looks. Then Pyrilampes and Perictione had a son together, Antiphon.
So Plato had a half-brother.
Yes, Antiphon. And he actually shows up as a character in Plato's dialogue, Parmenides.
It really does sound like Plato's family circle was packed with notable Athenians. You mentioned he puts his relatives in the dialogues quite often.
He does. Glaucon and Adeimantus in The Republic, Charmides and Critias, have dialogues named after them or appear significantly. It suggests, maybe, a certain family pride.
Or perhaps using familiar figures to explore complex ideas.
Could be both. It certainly gives us, and you listening, a unique window into his world and the relationships that matter to him. It really helps paint that richer picture we talked about.
Okay, so a distinguished, complex family background, maybe even touched by the divine. Let's talk about his name, Plato. It doesn't sound like, well, a typical family name. Where did that come from?
Yeah, it's another one of those intriguing questions. Plato means broad, definitely a nickname, derived from the Greek word plates.
Broad. Broad how?
Well, that's the debate. The name Plato itself wasn't super uncommon in Athens, but it doesn't seem to be in his known family line. So it stuck out. Even his name has this air of mystery, which is fascinating for such a foundational thinker.
So where did the nickname originate? What are the theories?
Diogenes Laertius, the ancient biographer, gives us a few options. One popular one is that his wrestling coach, a guy named Ariston of Argos, called him Plato because of his broad chest and shoulders. He was apparently quite athletic.
Ah, the wrestler theory. Okay.
Another idea is that it referred to his rhetorical breadth, his wide-ranging intellect and style of speaking, or maybe even just his wide forehead.
Huh. So broad shoulders, broad intellect, or broad forehead. Take your pick.
Pretty much. Even Seneca later connects the name to his broad chest when talking about simple living. But yeah, the point is it wasn't his given name.
Right. What was his birth name then?
Most sources agree his birth name was likely Aristocles.
Aristocles. What does that mean?
It means best reputation. A fitting name, perhaps. It's thought he was named after his paternal grandfather, which was a very common custom in Athens.
Okay. Aristocles. That seems straightforward enough.
Well, mostly. There's an inscription mentioning an Aristocles who was an archon, a high official, in Athens around the right time. But the direct link proving he was Plato's grandfather isn't definitively established.
So even the assumed birth name isn't 100% certain. Amazing.
It really highlights the challenges of reconstructing lives from so long ago. There's even been a recent argument questioning if Aristocles was his name at all, suggesting it might be a later invention.
Wow.
But the counter-argument is strong. The name appears so consistently in ancient sources that it probably does have a basis in fact, but still, that little bit of doubt remains.
Fascinating. Okay, so a possibly divinely hinted conception, a nickname that stuck, maybe named Aristocles. What about his education? He clearly didn't just rely on family connections.
No, definitely not. Ancient sources paint him as exceptionally bright, very studious, but also quite modest as a boy. Apuleius, citing Plato's nephew Speusippus, mentions his quick mind and dedication to learning early on.
And his father made sure he got a good education.
Absolutely. A top-tier Athenian education for a boy of his class would have included grammar, music, and gymnastics or physical training, taught by the best available instructors.
Music and gymnastics. We heard about the wrestling connection with the nickname. Music seems important too.
Very much so in Greek education. It was thought to cultivate harmony in the soul. Plato actually mentions a music theorist named Damon in the Republic, suggesting he was likely an influence.
And the physical side. The wrestling wasn't just a hobby.
Apparently not just a hobby. Dicæarchus goes so far as to claim Plato actually competed in the Isthmian Games.
One of the major Panhellenic games, like the Olympics.
Exactly. So, potentially a serious athlete alongside his intellectual pursuits. A well-rounded youth.
Definitely sounds like it. Now, his philosophical education. It didn't just start with Socrates, right? He encountered other ideas first.
That's correct. Before he became a follower of Socrates, Plato was apparently exposed to the ideas of Cratylus.
Cratylus. Wasn't he a follower of Heraclitus?
Yes, exactly. Heraclitus, the philosopher, famous for the idea that everything is in constant flux, constant change. The you can't step into the same river twice guy.
Right, everything flows. So Plato heard those ideas early on.
Seems so, probably through Cratylus. So he was already thinking about the nature of reality and change before meeting Socrates.
And just to address a common misconception, there's that story about him meeting the prophet Jeremiah in Egypt.
Ah, yes.
Oh.
That's historically inaccurate. Ambrose claimed it, and Augustine initially repeated it, but Augustine later corrected himself in the City of God. He pointed out Plato was born about a century after Jeremiah lived. Simple chronological error.
Good to clear that up. Okay, so we have the family, the name mystery, the solid education. Now let's get to the core influences on his actual philosophy. Socrates looms large, obviously, but who else was critical?
Socrates is absolutely central, no question. But you really can't understand Plato fully without appreciating the massive influence of Pythagoras and Pythagoreanism.
Pythagoras, mathematician, the theorem guy.
The very same, but much more than just the theorem. Aristotle himself said Plato's philosophy closely followed Pythagorean teachings. Cicero went even further, suggesting Plato basically learned everything from the Pythagoreans.
Everything. That's a huge claim.
It is, and maybe an exaggeration, but it shows how strong the perceived connection was. Several core Pythagorean ideas seem to deeply resonate in Plato's work.
Okay, like what? What were these key Pythagorean concepts?
Well, first, the idea that the universe is fundamentally mathematical. that everything can be understood through numbers and numerical relationships.
Numbers as the basis of reality.
Exactly. And connected to that, the idea of form being distinct from matter. The Pythagoreans saw the physical world we experience as sort of imperfect copies or reflections of an internal underlying mathematical reality.
That sounds familiar. Very Platonic, almost.
Precisely. It's a clear precursor to Plato's own theory of forms. There's also a likely shared influence from Orphism, a set of religious beliefs, particularly the idea of metempsychosis.
Metempsychosis. That's the transmigration of souls, right? Reincarnation.
Yes, the soul being reborn into different bodies. That idea also appears strongly in Plato, and likely has Pythagorean or Orphic roots.
So this hidden, perfect world graphed by intellect and the soul's journey. Pythagoras seems key.
Absolutely. George Karamanolis points out that later thinkers like Numenius saw both Pythagoras and Plato as major authorities, but often treated Pythagoras as the original source of true philosophy. Maybe Plato's extensive writings just made his version more widely known over Pythagoras' more oral tradition.
That makes sense. The written word lasts. Did R.M. Hare identify specific areas of influence too?
Yes. Hare points out three key things Plato seems to have drawn from Pythagoras. First, the model of a tightly knit community of like-minded thinkers like Pythagoras had in Croton. The Academy seems to echo that.
Ah, the intellectual community. Okay.
Second, the huge importance placed on mathematics and abstract thought, not just for science, but for philosophy and ethics too. Thinking abstractly purifies the mind in a way.
Right. Math as mental training.
And third, a kind of mystical approach to the soul and its relationship to the material world, its origins, its destiny.
Community, math, mysticism. You can definitely see those threads woven throughout Plato's philosophy. Okay, so Pythagoras was huge. What about other pre-Socratics? Heraclitus we mentioned, and Parmenides.
Yes, Heraclitus and Parmenides are crucial. They represent two opposing poles of thought about reality that Plato absolutely had to grapple with. They really kick off the whole metaphysical tradition, moving beyond myths.
So Heraclitus, as we said, was all about change, constant flux, everything flows.
Right. The world is fundamentally dynamic, ever-changing. Plato likely got this view via Cratylus, who apparently took it to such an extreme he thought you couldn't even reliably name things because they were changing so fast.
Wow, that's taking it pretty far. And Parmenides, he was the complete opposite.
Totally the opposite. Parmenides argued that reality is actually one, unified and unchanging. All the change and diversity we seem to perceive through our senses, that's basically an illusion.
Whoa, so nothing actually changes.
According to Parmenides, nope. True being is static and eternal. John Palmer argues Parmenides is really a founder of metaphysics, the study of being itself, because he made this sharp distinction between what truly is and what merely appears to be.
Constant change versus absolute permanence. Those are fundamentally conflicting views of the world. How did Plato deal with that? Did he just pick a side?
He didn't just pick a side. You could say his theory of forms is, in part, an attempt to reconcile these two extremes. He wanted to account for both the changing world we experience and the possibility of unchanging, eternal truths or knowledge.
So finding a way to have both stability and change.
In a sense, yes. He even wrote a dialogue called Parmenides, where he has Socrates debate with Parmenides himself and Parmenides' student Zeno, the guy famous for the paradoxes about motion, like Achilles and the tortoise. It shows Plato wrestling directly with these ideas, even critically examining his own developing theories.
That's fascinating, using a dialogue to critique his own ideas through the mouths of his predecessors. Did he address it elsewhere?
Yes, in the Sophist dialogue, he has a character, an Eleatic stranger, a follower of Parmenides, argue against the really strict interpretation of Parmenides. He gets into the basics of language, distinguishing nouns and verbs, subjects and predicates.
Early linguistics.
Kind of. And he uses this to argue that both motion and rest must in some sense be, to both exist. This directly challenges the hardcore Parmenidean view that only static being is real. So Plato is actively engaging, refining, and finding his own path between these powerful opposing views. Understanding this backdrop really helps you appreciate what Plato was trying to achieve.
Absolutely. It wasn't just ideas appearing in a vacuum. He was responding to a vibrant, contentious, philosophical landscape. Okay, and now, the big one, Socrates.
Socrates, yes, unquestionably the most significant personal influence on Plato. Plato was his devoted young follower. But their exact relationship, intellectually speaking, is notoriously tricky to untangle.
This is the Socratic problem, right?
It's exactly. The challenge of figuring out where the historical Socrates ends and Plato's portrayal, or maybe even Plato's own philosophy, put into Socrates' mouth begins, It's a genuine puzzle for scholars.
Because Plato wrote dialogues, not philosophical treatises in his own name, and Socrates is nearly always the main speaker.
Precisely. Plato himself almost never speaks directly in the dialogues, the Laws being a major exception. He consistently presents his ideas through Socrates. There's even that line in the second letter, its authenticity is debated, but it's subjective, claiming Plato's writings are just Socrates become beautiful and new.
Which really muddies the waters. And other people wrote about Socrates too, like Xenophon and Aristophanes, and they give different pictures.
Right. Xenophon, Socrates in the Memorabilia seems more practical, less metaphysical. Aristophanes' Socrates in the comedy The Clouds is a satirical caricature of a natural philosopher and sophist. So, which is the real Socrates? It's tough to say. Leo Strauss also pointed out Socrates' famous irony was he always saying what he truly believed, even in Plato's dialogues.
So how much of the philosophy we call Plato's was actually originated by Socrates? And how much did Plato develop himself, using Socrates as a character?
That's the million drachma question. Aristotle, who studied with Plato but also knew people who knew Socrates, actually attributes distinct ideas to each. He suggests Socrates was focused on definitions and ethics, seeking universal concepts within our world.
Okay.
Whereas Aristotle credits Plato with separating the forms, making them these transcendent, perfect entities existing in their own realm outside of our physical world.
Ah, so Aristotle saw a clear difference there. Socrates looking for universals here and now, Plato positing them in a separate reality. That's a huge distinction.
It is. It suggests that while Socrates was the catalyst, Plato took the ideas in a significantly new, more metaphysical direction. Even if Plato presents these transcendent forms through Socrates' voice, you wonder if Plato was already evolving these ideas while Socrates was still alive, or if it was mostly after Socrates' death.
And what about the more mystical stuff in the dialogues? Reincarnation, mystery religions?
That's another area where many scholars see more of Plato than the historical Socrates. Ideas about the soul's immortality, its cycles of rebirth, connections to mystery cults like the Eleusinian Mysteries, these often feel more distinctly Platonic, maybe influenced by those Pythagorean ideas we discussed.
Although Plato does mention the Eleusinian Mysteries in the Melamana dialogue, suggesting maybe both he and Socrates were familiar with them, perhaps even initiated.
It's possible the line between them remains blurry, but it's clear Socrates was the pivotal figure, the one who turned Plato towards philosophy and whose method and ethical focus profoundly shaped Plato's entire project, even as Plato developed his own unique metaphysical system.
So a complex tapestry of influences. Pythagoras' math and mysticism, the Heraclitus-Parmenides debate on change and permanence, and towering over it all, Socrates, all feeding into Plato's own groundbreaking ideas like the theory of forms.
Exactly. And we can just briefly touch on the core of that theory as presented in dialogues like the Phaedo or On the Soul. Basically, Plato argues for at least two realms of existence.
Two realms.
Yes. There's the world we perceive with our senses, the physical world. It's constantly changing, imperfect, like Heraclitus described. But then there's another world, or realm, which is invisible, eternal, and unchanging, like Parmenides envisioned being. This is the realm of the forms.
Forms.
Yeah.
Like perfect blueprints.
Sort of. Perfect abstract concepts or universals. The form of beauty itself, the form of justice, the form of chairness even. These forms are accessible not through our senses, but through pure reason, through logical thought, what the Greeks called logikon.
So the physical things we see are just shadows or imperfect copies of these true forms.
That's the core idea. And this is what Platonic idealism really refers to. Not the later idea that matter isn't real, but that these forms, these ideas or concepts, are the most real things, the true reality. He even hints maybe at a third realm, like mental images, but the forms are paramount.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to take in, but it sets the stage beautifully. Looking back on everything we've covered about his early life and influences, what are the main things you want people to take away?
I think the key thing is realizing just how rich and, frankly, complex Plato's background was. He wasn't just some abstract thinker disconnected from the world. You've got this noble, politically connected family navigating turbulent times.
Right, the 30 tyrants connection.
Exactly. Then there's the solid, well-rounded education, physical and intellectual. The enduring mystery, even around his name, adds another layer. It reminds you that history, even for giants like Plato, has gaps and ambiguities.
And the philosophical influences were incredibly diverse, too.
Absolutely. You have Pythagoras bringing in math, mysticism, the idea of an ordered community. You have Heraclitus and Parmenides setting up this fundamental tension between change and permanence that Plato spent his life trying to resolve, and then, of course, Socrates providing the ethical focus and the dialectical method.
So understanding all that context really gives you a deeper appreciation for why Plato thought what he thought and why his ideas took the shape they did.
Precisely. It helps you see his philosophy not just as a set of doctrines, but as a dynamic response to the intellectual currents and the lived experiences of his time. It makes his contribution to Western thought feel even more significant, I think.
It definitely adds layers of understanding. Okay, this has been fantastic. A real deep dive into the foundations. It certainly shows there's always more beneath the surface, even with figures we think we know well. So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on.
Yeah.
Considering all these varied influences, the mystical Pythagoreans, the logical Parmenides, the ethical Socrates, his family's political entanglements, how did Plato manage to synthesize these seemingly disparate threads into his own unique, coherent philosophy? What does that process tell us about how great intellectual leaps are actually made?
Ooh, that's a great question to ponder. How does innovation arise from integrating such diverse sources?
Something to think about. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive.